Chief Justice, other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name's Peter Applegather. I'm a judge of the Supreme Court. On behalf of the President of the Australian Academy of Law, the Honourable Alan Robertson of Senior Counsel, may I welcome you to this event. May I also welcome you on behalf of the Selden Society Australia and the Supreme Court Library of Queensland, which has been instrumental in arranging this webinar. The Academy of Law is a broadly based non-governmental body comprised of individuals from all parts of the legal community. Individual fellows work collectively to advance the discipline of law. The Academy seeks to promote the highest standards of legal scholarship, education, legal practice, and the administration of justice. The Academy provides a forum for cooperation, collaboration, constructive debate, and the exchange of views among all branches of the legal community. An example of what lies at the heart of the Academy's activities is tonight's event. The Academy aims to hold one event in each state and territory every year. In Queensland, the event is held annually in the Banco Court and again relies upon the fantastic support of the Supreme Court Library and the Selden Society. This year, we're unable to gather in large numbers in person, but our audience is bigger in size than ever. I welcome you wherever you happen to be. Sunday just gone marked the 100th anniversary of the passing of Samuel Griffith. On Griffith's retirement from the High Court in 1919, the Queensland Premier, T.J. Ryan, said that Griffith was, quote, a great statesman, a great lawyer, a great judge and a great scholar, but he was a man of unimpeachable integrity and of single-minded purpose and burning patriotism. No one could have believed more firmly than he did in the gospel of hard work or have made it more completely a guiding principle of his life. Certainly, no man ever laboured more strenuously or more self-sacrificingly for the good of the people, unquote. The products of Griffith's labours surround us: this nation's constitution, the Griffith Criminal Code that applies, largely unaltered after 120 years in many states and territories, in Papua New Guinea and in other places, the general law that Griffith made as a judge, as Chief Justice of Queensland, and then as the first Chief Justice of Australia. A long list of enduring achievements to celebrate. This was to be the year of lectures and an exhibition here in our library. They are delayed, not cancelled. Tonight we're going to race through 5 aspects of Griffith's life. Sadly, each of our distinguished speakers is confined to about 10 minutes, to be followed by a panel discussion. Each topic could warrant an all-day seminar in its own right. In the interest of saving time, I'm not going to detail each of the speakers' fantastic background. I'll give some brief biographical details, but other details are available on the website. When we consider Griffith's combined qualities as a scholar, a lawyer, a politician, a statesman and a jurist, we face the fact that each century must produce only a few individuals of that exceptional stature. We should reflect too on the number of centuries the lands on which we gather have been occupied by their traditional owners. Over those millennia, there must have been many men and women of Griffith's intelligence, industry, learning and leadership. Our first speaker, Dr. Raymond Evans, has written about that ancient history and also about modern Australian history. Raymond has written about life in Queensland in Griffith's time. With other historians, he's documented Australia's federation story. Raymond Evans shares with Samuel Griffith the experience of being a migrant from Wales. Samuel Griffith arrived in Australia as a boy in 1853. Raymond Evans arrived in Australia as a boy in 1949. They were both born in Mirtha, Tidville, so there can be no historian better qualified to speak about Griffith's early life and the Welsh immigrant experience than Dr. Raymond Evans.
Thanks very much, Peter. Well, this little investigation is called Mirtha and Sir Samuel, Griffith's Welsh Odyssey. When Samuel Walker Griffith first returned briefly to his birthplace, Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales, in late 1866 as a lowly articled clerk, the town paid him virtually no heed. And he too was disheartened and even repulsed by it. He noted in his travel diary that it was, quote, grimy and dirty exceedingly, with immense, unsightly slag heaps of iron ore lying all about. Touring the Cavartha Ironworks, he would have observed some of its 4,000 workers, their bodies illumined by the huge pig iron furnaces, as one recent historian describes them, with their deafening blasts, snapping, crackling and hissing, escaping gases, vivid furnace flames, glowing ribbons of molten metal and thunderous hammering. He stayed for a mere 2 days in the Castle Inn at the town centre, close by the Congregational Chapel in Market Square, where his father Edward, a biblical scholar, had once preached before himself escaping to greener parts of Wales. Did Griffith know that in 1831 the town's ironmasters and coal kings had been held under siege inside this very same hotel by around 10,000 striking workers, and that Scottish troops of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders had opened fire from its windows onto the huge crowd, leaving some 25 dead and 70 injured in the high street outside? If Griffith did know, he didn't mention it. But this was the place of Griffith's birth, a place that was an epicentre of incipient industrial struggle and indeed of the Industrial Revolution itself, producing 40% of all the pig iron for global railways, naval vessels, bridges, machinery, etc., from 4 enormous industrial establishments. At this time, the largest factories in the world, employing tens of thousands of men, women and children. Griffith was born here in June 1845. The historian and essayist Thomas Carlyle, who visited 5 years later, dubbed this metropolis with explicit horror, quote, the squalidest, ugliest place on earth. Its ironworks, he wrote, were, quote, like a vision of hell that will never leave me, with their hard, fierce and miserable-looking workers broiling all in sweat and dirt amid their furnaces, pits and rolling mills. A century earlier, the region had been relatively uninhabited, save by scattered farmers and shepherds, but had been transformed by rapid industrialisation into one of the fastest growing urban centres in the Western world at the time. It was a narrow triangular company town, thrown up in higgledy-piggledy fashion along a 10-mile stretch of the River Taff. As a product of pecuniary and uncaring private enterprise, it was an unplanned, insanitary disgrace. Houses without latrines or drainage, built in scattered confusion. Just after Griffith's parents-to-be moved here, late in 1842, the London Times noted that this miserably ill-built place was somewhere where nobody would live for choice except to make money. But Edward Griffith, with his new wife Mary Walker, had come to harvest souls rather than to amass wealth. For Mirtha was also the main population centre of Welsh religious nonconformity, bristling with tiny chapels. Yet its dangers and drawbacks soon outweighed its spiritual advantages. The Griffiths' first child, a son, was born in September 43, with Samuel following some 20 months later. Infant mortality was so rife in this town, with epidemics of whooping cough, scarlet fever, cholera, typhus, etc., that roughly up to 80% of the babies died before their first birthday. Average age expectancy was a staggeringly low 17.5 years. Furthermore, Edward Griffith found that the factory fumes were detrimentally affecting his preaching voice. So before Samuel was a year old, the family had decamped to the English fishing port of Portishead, 10 miles from Bristol, and a far more salubrious 2-storey home. So much then for Griffith's Welsh birth origins. When he returned in 1866, he would not have carried the slightest childhood recollection of Mirtha consciously within him. And so discouraged had he been by the sight of the place when he revisited Britain for 13 weeks in 1880 to 81, he did not set foot back there, even though his mansion, Mirtha House in Brisbane, had just been completed. Yet, some 4 years later, an unfolding string of events would return him in some high degree of welcome and acclaim. It all unfolded like this. During 1885, a journalist from Cardiff's Western Mail newspaper, writing under the pen name of Morian, was covering the annual meeting of the Congregational Union in London when he saw, quote, a venerable preacher ascending the platform. It was Edward Griffith, Samuel's father. He listened as this man related old recollections of Mirtha Tydvil, eventually informing his audience that his own Mirtha-born boy, as he put it, was now, quote, the Prime Minister of Queensland, Sir S.W. Griffith. So when the following year Morian happened to mention in the Western Mail that, quote, the Prime Minister of the great colony of Queensland was a native of Mirtha Tydvil, and a copy of that paper turned up in Brisbane, things started to happen. A Welsh migrant named Ben Jones, who received this news at Clydach Cottage, Fortitude Valley, rapidly conveyed it to the Colonial Secretary's Department. And the Premier, Griffith, a man not averse to the sweet touch of praise and fame, replied almost immediately to Jones, confessing, quote, that it gives me great pleasure to think that I am not unknown in my native land. He hoped he might find time for a revisit when in Britain for the Queen's Golden Jubilee and the 1887 Colonial Conference in a few weeks' time, as he put it. Thus the wheels were set in motion for a triumphal return to Mirtha Tydvil. Ben Jones communicated to Morian, or Owen Morgan, to give him his birth name, that Sir Samuel was, quote, undoubtedly the most popular man in Brisbane, as well as a true friend of his Cambrian countrymen, having recently, at considerable inconvenience to himself, travelled to Gympie by steamer and rail to preside over a Welsh Eisteddfod. Morgan, in turn, informed W.L. Daniel, Mirtha's High Constable, quote, that the most able statesman in Australia and a son of the town was heading for Great Britain. Within a fortnight of Griffith's London arrival, the High Constable had written to, quote, the most brilliant politician in Queensland, inviting him down. Will the metropolis of Wales give him a welcome? Wrote Morian somewhat breathlessly. Will Mirtha, his native town, the old town of the Iron Kings, accord him a welcome worthy of him and itself? He is a worthy son of the Sparta of Western Europe, Cymru. Well, of course, Mirtha said yes, and Sir Samuel said yes. Indeed, so eager was he now to visit that he ultimately left behind in London his wife, Lady Julia, suffering from pneumonia. So in the late afternoon of Wednesday, the 13th of April 1887, he alighted once more from the Taff Vale train and into the town after stopping at nearby Pontypridd to tell a cheering crowd that he was sorry he was unable to address them in their native tongue. And Mirtha itself, pomp and ceremony, moved up a notch. As his train arrived, there was, quote, a considerable discharge of detonators, and as he appeared on the platform, massed choirs, in capital letters, of 600 voices broke into an ode specially written for the occasion. A military brass band, once praised by Charles Dickens, then ushered him out to a waiting carriage to the tune of Men of Harlech. Griffith appeared delighted. He took off his hat and bowed courteously with a genial smile upon his face. His carriage, drawn in procession by a pair of fine horses, then proceeded past much bunting, people calling from upstairs windows, with school children waving Welsh flags in the street and sporting their bright Jubilee medals. he was on his way to the faux Gothic-cum-Tudor Cavartha Castle, home of one of Mirtha's great Iron Kings, William Crawshay. William, like all the male Crawshays, was an implacable enemy of encroaching trade unionism. But his mother, Rosemary, was inquisitive and progressive, an advocate of cremation, euthanasia and feminism. At the castle, she had already entertained such luminaries as Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, T.H. Huxley, Robert Owen, and the poets Robert Browning and Ralph Waldo Emerson. The following evening, the Queensland Premier was feted with a grand banquet at a venue strangely named the Bush Hotel, sitting beneath what the Welsh would call a beautiful banner of red silk inscribed, "Welcome, Sir Samuel Griffith." All of the region's leading lights were present, including the American consul and someone called Christmas Evans. There were, however, no working class representatives there. All the expected statements of mutual hubris and praise were delivered in many speeches wherein Griffith, who said the Chief Constable a few weeks ago was comparatively unknown to them, was continually referred to once more as, quote, Prime Minister of the colony of Queensland. Griffith, speaking in reply to rounds and rounds of applause, reinforced the ideal of imperial union, reassuring everyone that Queenslanders were, quote, not trammelled by any old prejudices and were never afraid of anything because it was new. To loud cheering, he concluded that he should never forget Mirtha Tydfil and would in future endeavour to bring no disgrace upon its name. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this lofty, fleeting visit, apart from the illuminated scroll that he received to hang in his study back home, is contained in a couple of letters that Owen Morgan wrote to him a few days later. Morion had also spoken at the Mirtha banquet, reminding all that it was he who had been the first to introduce Sir Samuel's name to his native country. Now, he informed the Premier, "Your features remind me of the Pritchard and Gibbon families, who are descendants of the Cardigan and Glamorgan royal tribes, of which Wales contained 15. He advised Griffith on how to obtain the collected pedigrees of Morganwig and Glamorgan, setting him off on what his biographer Roger Joyce calls a genealogical search that was to prove time-consuming, costly, and eventually futile. In short, an expensive wild goose chase. Research shows us that Morion himself was something of a journalistic fantasist. At the time of meeting Griffith, he was compiling a volume on Druidism written in the Welsh language. Several years later, he published a book entitled The Light of Britannia, containing chapters on King Arthur in Wales, St Paul's supposed journey to South Wales, and phallic worship. But he, more than anyone, had touched upon a rich vein of romance and vanity in Griffith and planted the vain hope there that this new knight might well be a descendant of kings rather than simply born in some dirty old town without form and order and, quote, disgraceful to those who are responsible for it. Thanks.
Thank you, Raymond. Our next speaker is the Chief Justice of Queensland, the Honourable Catherine Holmes, a scholar and jurist who needs no introduction. We're delighted and privileged that the Chief Justice could contribute to this seminar by speaking about a few aspects of Griffith's complex career as a politician.
It's a tough call to confine a discussion of Griffiths as a politician to 10 minutes, when he was in that role for over 20 years with a lot of colour and movement. He entered the Legislative Assembly in 1872 and became leader of the opposition Liberal Party in 1879. He was Premier between 1883 and 1888, and again between 1890 and 1893, largely swapping the role back and forth with Thomas McIlwraith, the leader of the Conservatives. In the Queensland Figaro newspaper, which was a sort of Punch equivalent, and possibly elsewhere, Griffith was referred to as Oily Sam, apparently because of his ease in changing positions. I'll use a more charitable term for that characteristic. Griffith, as a politician, was what we might nowadays call agile. I'm going to focus on that characteristic with three examples. For the first, I'm indebted to a paper by Professor Greg Taylor, although my views are not necessarily the same as his. Pre-pandemic, he was scheduled to give a Selden Society lecture on Griffith's plan for the United Provinces of Queensland. I very much hope that will still come to pass. But here's a potted version. Through the 1880s, there was a burgeoning separation movement aiming for the division of Queensland into 3 states, with the capitals being Brisbane, Townsville and Rockhampton. Extra border crossings in a pandemic. The leader of the North Queensland push was John Mirtha McCrossan, the member for Townsville, from whom 3 Chief Justices of this state were to be descended. In some ways, it was the United States geographically reversed. The North wanted to secede, so sugar growers were ensured a continued supply of Pacific Island labourers, a trade resisted in the South as effectively slavery, although should also be said in other quarters on the less attractive basis that it was a threat to racial purity. I'll be coming back to the Pacific Island labour subject later. As to central Queensland, the visiting novelist Anthony Trollope commented in 1871 that Rockhampton considers itself to be the second town of the colony and thinks a great deal of itself. It has been seized with the ambition to become a capital and therefore hates Brisbane. That was about right. The central Queenslanders had mining and cattle money and delusions of grandeur. In late 1890, John McCrossan tabled a resolution in the Legislative Assembly for the separation of Queensland into northern and southern colonies. Demonstrating his adroitness, Griffith countered with an amendment which would instead have separated the state into 3 provinces, imaginatively called North Queensland, Central Queensland and Southern Queensland, united under a federal Queensland government. The whole proposal then went nowhere, and opinions differed as to whether Griffith's amendment reflected open-mindedness or a cunning stalling tactic. In 1892, with the separationists agitating with the Colonial Office to get their way, Griffith deflected them once more with a bill to divide the state into the 3 provinces. There was resistance. A motion was passed instead for a 2-province scheme, North and South Queensland. Ever adaptable, Griffith introduced a second bill, this time for those 2 provinces. This was not all time wasted, because this must have been a very useful dry run, all this drafting, for the federal constitution. His bill passed the Legislative Assembly, but it was rejected by the Legislative Council, the argument being that the public ought to be able to have its say on the matter at the 1893 election. Whether Griffith would have found a new position on this whole province question, we don't know, because in March 1893, he became Chief Justice of Queensland. The new Premier opposed separation of any kind, and the 1890s depression overwhelmed Queensland. By the time it ended, the focus instead was on national federation. Professor Taylor also posits that some of the Northerners lost their enthusiasm because of the Labor movement's success in the 1893 election. They feared that their separate state would end up ruled by a Labor government opposed to the bringing in of Pacific Islander labour. Which brings me to the second example of Griffith's agility. He was opposed to that trade in human beings, which often involved abduction at gunpoint. In 1884, during his first period as Premier, he legislated to introduce stronger controls on recruiting Pacific Island labourers and restricted the use of their labour to sugar plantations. Some kidnapped workers were actually repatriated in this period. In 1885, he passed legislation ending the issuing of licensing for the bringing in of these islanders as labourers, which was to have effect from the end of 1890. But in 1890, after a period out of government, Griffith became Premier again by forming an alliance with his old political enemy McIlwraith, whom he had previously denounced as corrupt. So in itself, this coalition was an example of agility. In 1892, Griffith reversed his position on the trade in Pacific Island labour, arguing that extending it for another 10 years was justified because of the Depression and the competition from subsidised European beet sugar. According to Roger Joyce's biography of him, Griffith suddenly became very popular with the northern sugar planters who used to propose Damn Sam Griffith toasts. Now they gave him champagne breakfasts. Final agility instance. For much of his political career, Griffith was seen as something of a revolutionary. You can read more on that subject in Clifford Panham's 1964 Australian Law Journal article titled The Radical Chief Justice. In 1888, Griffith had lost government to McIlwraith's Nationalist Party. While in opposition, possibly in a bid to woo the working class, he wrote an article for William Lane's newspaper, The Boomerang. His diary records that he wrote it a few days after he finished reading Das Kapital. The article's thesis was that the state should ensure a fair division of profits between employers and employees. The worker should receive not only his wage, but a share in the increased value his labour added to the raw materials in the production process. Griffith produced a revised version of the article the following year, rejecting accusations that this was communism or socialism or revolutionary. He did not, he maintained, propose to take anybody's property away from them, and he recognised that the capitalist had a right to a reasonable return on investment, but it was also, he said, a law of natural justice that the product of a man's labour, after costs, belonged to him. And he took some steps towards this. In 1890, early 1890, while still in opposition, he introduced a bill to declare the natural law relating to the acquisition and ownership of private property, its short title being the Elementary Property Law of Queensland. It stated a number of principles, including that the net product of labour belonged to the persons concerned in its production, it being the state's duty to provide for its proper distribution in accordance with the stated principles. The worker's entitlement could be enforced by proceedings in a court of competent jurisdiction. The bill got as far as its first reading. But 3 weeks later, Griffith got back into government through coalition with the Conservative McIlwraith and dropped the issue. And in 1891, Griffith, the workers' friend, sent in the army to break up the shearers' strike. Now that, I think, is about all that I have time for. We are all in enormous debt to Griffith for his role in drafting the Commonwealth Constitution. As a criminal lawyer, I bless him for the criminal code. Many of us would have been delighted if, given his service as Chief Justice in 2 jurisdictions, that had been reflected in the naming of this very court building. But when it comes to Griffith as a politician, the best I can say is that he was agile, very agile.
Thank you, Chief Justice. Our next speaker is John Mckenna of Queen's Counsel, a scholar, a leader of the bar, an accomplished historian. John's written about Griffith's career as a barrister and is undertaking broader research into key figures in colonial Queensland history. A link to John's outstanding paper, the Griffith Opinion Books, is on the library's webpage for this event. John Mckenna.
Of all the Queensland lawyers of the 19th century, we know so much more about Griffith than anyone else. His work in court is recorded very carefully in the detailed newspaper reports of the time, where, because of the great public interest in what was going on in courts, there are précis of almost every case he ever appeared in. For his daily life in practice, we have the private diaries which Griffith maintained throughout his life. And for his own thinking as a young lawyer, we're particularly fortunate to have a sample of about 180 of the opinions that he wrote really over the whole of his career, from the time he started as a barrister till the time he ended. They were all provided to two local Queensland firms who carefully preserved them over the years and then donated them to this library about 10 years ago. This material provides the best evidence we have to understand what legal practice really was like during the late 19th century. But more significantly, it provides important clues to understand how Griffith, as an immigrant child from very humble circumstances, developed the formidable skills and the public regard which was required to go on to achieve what he did in later life. His legal career began at the age of 17 in 1863, when he commenced a period of 3 years' articles of clerkship in Brisbane. I should pause here and say something about the circumstances of the time. The year 1863 was only the 4th year after Queensland's separation, and at the time, Brisbane was quite a small town with a population of about 12,000 people. It was about the same size as current-day Warwick. There were only 2 judges to serve the whole of Queensland, Chief Justice Cockle and Justice Lutwich. There was no district court. Queensland only had 8 practising barristers, all of whom were based in Brisbane, and only 24 practising solicitors, who were distributed across the main towns of the colony. At the time, Queensland essentially had an agricultural economy based on wool. So for lawyers, on the civil side, their work was largely concerned with conveyancing, wills, debt recovery, partnership relationships, and the like. On the criminal side, the work was largely stemmed from drunkenness and theft, with only about a handful of capital offences committed every year. In the world of law and politics, the focus in Brisbane was upon the former convict barracks, which stood in Queen Street, Brisbane, between George and Albert Streets. It was a long building with 2 wings separated by an archway. The Supreme Court was based in a single courtroom in the former chapel of this building above the archway, and the 2 parliamentary chambers of the new Queensland Parliament were located on the 2 levels of the northern wing of this complex. Whilst Griffith was only 17 when he commenced his articles, he'd already completed an arts degree from the University of Sydney, and this was quite unusual. It was a little unusual to have completed 3 years of university study by the age of 17, but it was very unusual for an article clerk to have had any university education at all. We have to remember that Queensland didn't have a university at all until after 1909, the 50th anniversary of separation. And whilst it was possible for aspiring Queensland lawyers to go away to university at Sydney or Melbourne, only a handful did this during the 19th century. So Griffith was one of the fortunate few. He came to the legal profession with a sound academic training, not in law, but in the kind of rigorous thinking required across a range of disciplines, including mathematics. When he returned from Sydney, he moved back into the family home at the northern end of Adelaide Street and started articles of clerkship with a man called Arthur McAllister. Now, obtaining really good articles of clerkship was critical for any aspiring lawyer. It was effectively an apprenticeship into the law, which, depending on the circumstances, could involve either 3 years of menial work, or one could find oneself getting broad experience, developing good legal skills at a very early stage in your career. For Griffith, his articles seems to have fallen into the second category. McAllister was one of Queensland's leading solicitors. He was really the first solicitor to establish a viable legal practice at Ipswich, which was then the gateway to the Darling Downs, and so something of a commercial centre. However, McAllister's real interest was in politics. He was elected to the first Queensland Parliament, and within a couple of years was elevated to ministerial office. In fact, he became Premier of Queensland during the course of Griffith's articles. In 1863, the year that Griffith started his articles, McAllister moved from Ipswich to Brisbane to pursue his political interests and relocated his practice here, engaging Griffith as his article clerk. So with a master who was only available some of the time, Griffith was in a position to gain considerable experience and responsibility at a very early age. He was also fortunate during this period to have been awarded the Mort Travelling Scholarship by the University of Sydney. This allowed him to take a year away from articles to travel through Europe, to broaden his experience and his thinking about the world. This was another unique opportunity for a young Queenslander. So by 22, the age of 22, Griffith was already a young man of considerable skill and experience. And it was at that age, in 1867, that he started at the bar. His chambers were based in the recently opened Town Hall in Queen Street, Brisbane, next to the former convict barracks. If you haven't seen photographs of this building, it's well worth seeking them out, because you'll be surprised at its elegance. It was built with a large hall on the upper floor for council meetings and for concerts, but had professional offices on the lower floors, and it became the home of the bar for a number of years, until finally new court buildings were built at 300 George Street in 1879. Griffith practiced from chambers in the Town Hall for a total of 9 years as a junior, but his practice at the time was utterly unlike our own. Of course, there were no computers, there was no electricity, there weren't even typewriters at the time. Everything was done in handwriting. Pleadings, opinions, documents, evidence, everything was done in handwriting. There were no local law reports, indeed no law reports from any Australian colony at the time. Their practice depended upon the English materials which came out to the colonies by ship. So far as the Queensland colonial statutes were concerned, they were collected in only 2 volumes, and they were all very much focused on land law. As a consequence of this, briefs to barristers were short, trials were short, and as we see from Griffith's opinions at the time, they too were very short. A page or two of principled analysis of the issues was the order of the day. The timing of Griffith's decision to come to the bar really couldn't have been better. 1867 was in some ways a turning point for Queensland's economy. There was a discovery of significant gold at Gympie, which triggered a shift for Queensland away from agriculture towards mining and heavy industry. This led to an inflow of capital and the use of company structures for the first time in an economy that previously had been based upon sole traders and partnerships. This, of course, led to disputes about mining titles, about deals to do with mining and the like, and broadened significantly the kind of legal practice that existed in Queensland at the time. Secondly, this was a period of time when technological change and infrastructure development in Queensland led to rapid development. Railways were being built, bridges were being built, gas and water reticulation was being installed, electricity ultimately was being installed. And apart from the public benefit of all this, for government lawyers, all these developments created particular challenges that expanded the demands upon their time. Thirdly, it was an era of legal reform. The English in particular were rethinking so much of their legal system. It was a time of procedural reform with the passage of the Judicature Acts, and also substantive reforms in the law. Reforms to antiquated rules such as the rule of common employment that meant that a worker couldn't sue his employer for injuries caused by a fellow worker. Again, for those involved in the political life of Queensland and for those who are government lawyers, this was a great opportunity to reshape the law to suit the needs of the emerging economy. Fourthly, this was an era with a local court system expanded rapidly to meet the needs of a growing population. The District Court was established in 1866, and that instantly doubled the judiciary, or more than doubled the judiciary, from 2 to 5, and allowed court sittings to be held across regional Queensland. It facilitated the expansion of the volume and kind of work undertaken by the legal profession, and Griffith was perfectly placed to take advantage of all these developments. He was clever, way beyond the skills of his contemporaries at the time. He was industrious. He was renowned for working late into the night, famously working until a newly opened flask of whiskey had been fully consumed. He was decisive, and he had a drive to improve and reform things. He quickly became the most sought-after barrister in Queensland, and also received a significant amount of government work from a very early point in his career. Initially, this was through the Brisbane Municipal Council. Then in 1872, as we've heard, he commenced a parallel career in politics, which seems so odd to modern eyes. He spent his time from 1872 till 1893 serving both as a member of Queensland Parliament, while at the same time practising as a barrister with a busy private practice. During this period, the Queensland Public Service was very small. So particularly in his role as Attorney-General, Griffith's public role wasn't just as a politician. It included advising the governments, driving law reform, drafting legislation, and appearing in any significant matters in court, including significant criminal prosecutions. It's the years of experience of this kind, which he gained, that helps make sense of why Griffith had the respect of so many others in dealing with matters of government and constitutional matters. He took silk at the age of 30 in 1876 and continued in practice until the age of 47 when he became Chief Justice. He was practising at the private bar even whilst Premier of Queensland. It's impossible to single out notable cases from his era as a silk, as his name dominates the law reports from this era. But a very tangible measure of just how highly he was regarded can be seen in the special arrangements which had to be made to induce him to take on the role of Chief Justice. In 1892, Parliament passed the Chief Justice's Salary Act to increase the previous salary of £2,500 to £3,500 just to attract Griffith to the job. I might say a reform that was promptly repealed as soon as Griffith left Queensland. But it was during Griffith's tenure on the court that he not only presided over one of the strongest appellate courts in the country, but also drafted the criminal code and the new procedural rules required for both civil and criminal matters. As a lawyer, his combination of skill, experience and energy was simply unique.
Thank you, Ms Mckenna. Professor Carolyn Evans is Vice-Chancellor and President of Griffith University. She was awarded a doctorate from Oxford, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar and later taught. She works in the areas of law, religion and human rights. As a dynamic Vice-Chancellor, Professor Evans is very busy at the best of times. The demands on her time in present circumstances must be enormous, so we are honoured that Professor Evans is able to speak to us tonight about Griffith's role in drafting the Constitution.
Thank you very much. Well, as already been alluded to this evening, Sir Samuel Griffith was one of a handful of men, for men they all were, who played a significant role in the drafting and the direction of the Australian Constitution. Griffith's mark on the Constitution is enduring, despite the fact that his formal involvement in the process was relatively short-lived. The process towards federation was a relatively slow one. There'd been discussion and debate on the topic as early as the mid-19th century, but without the burning deck of a war of independence, civil war or revolution, there was no driving impetus, particularly for colonies who were rather enjoying the degree of self-governance that they had gained. By the later 19th century, the conditions for federation, in particular concerns around defence from foreign powers, were more fertile, and Sir Henry Parkes, the Premier of New South Wales, seized the moment with his Tenterfield oration to begin a renewed political push. Politically canny, he knew that this couldn't simply look like a takeover bid from the populous New South Wales. He would need support from around the country, and Griffith was one of the key people he turned to for support of these ideas in Queensland. The first formal round of discussions in which Griffith participated as one of the two delegates from Queensland was the Federation Conference of 1890, held in Melbourne. The aim of that gathering was to build political momentum and acceptance of key principles to underline the new constitution rather than a drafting exercise. Griffith was, as he'd long been, supportive of federation. He voted in favour of the principles. His participation, however, spoke to a caution and a clear view of the risks. He was not one of the strong advocates for federation at this point, but rather he focused on the obstacles that would come their way and which had ended other, much less ambitious attempts to coordinate colonial activity. Indeed, one can detect some bitterness about the failure of some of the activities he'd been involved with. Some saw he and Parkes as a good combination. Parkes had the lofty rhetoric and the vision, while Griffith had the down-to-earth attention to detail. Parkes, however, probably wisely kept to the high-level principle for which unanimous support was possible to build a political consensus, after which the more detailed work on constitutional drafting could take place in a series of conventions. Griffith, of course, came into his own with the Constitutional Convention held in March 1891 in Sydney. Parkes was expectedly elected President of the Convention, But as one scholar has noted, it was no empty compliment that Griffith was elected Vice President. It was a recognition of his skill and the critical role that others believed he was capable of playing. At this convention, the deliberations began in earnest around structure, wording and content of the Constitution. And this was the great convention. This was the one at the end. There was a draft of the Constitution that would be the foundation for all that came after. Griffith, whose skill in drafting an analytical legal mind, as well as the prestige and experience of having been Premier of a key colony, was in his element. And it was at this convention he played his most significant role in constitution drafting. As Deakin later wrote, in every clause it bore the stamp of Samuel Griffith's patient and untiring handiwork, his terse, clear style and force of explanation. Prior to this convention, there were 2 draft constitutions prepared. The first was by the Tasmanian, Andrew Inglis Clark, and it was based on his extensive research, particularly in the United States. Inglis Clark was a great promoter of the United States model of constitutionality. The second was by Charles Kingston from South Australia. It appears that Kingston had seen the Inglis Clark draft and had modelled it somewhat on that, but it was substantially reworked and restructured and involved some new ideas, including the notion that the federal government would have control of industrial arbitration. Griffith had both of these documents, and his paper showed not only had he read, but he had substantially marked up and written extensive comments on the Inglis Clark draft. Using this draft in particular, Griffith then developed his own draft of the Constitution that incorporated much from Inglis Clark, but was also distinct in many respects. Barton and Deakin didn't draft their own versions, but had undertaken meticulous preparation and reading, unlike Parkes, who was happy to admit as much, and many of the others. The 3 drafters and these 2 therefore formed really the core group that drove this convention. The 1891 convention had 3 subcommittees, the most significant of which was simply called the Constitutional Committee. Griffith chaired this, and its role was to prepare a draft constitution. It was an onerous task. He recognised that there was a need to find some uninterrupted time, both away from other delegates and also the press. And Griffith therefore invited a key group to spend Easter sailing on the Queensland government steamer, the Lucinda. The Lucinda was a luxury vessel for the time, and Griffith had already used it judiciously to entertain fellow delegates. He thought it was actually a very useful tool in the constitutional drafting process. This time he invited Inglis Clark and Kingston to join him as the core working party to produce a draft for the consideration of the convention. Inglis Clark came down with influenza and had to miss the first few days, sniping later that the others had gone off on a joy trip and had messed up the judicial chapters of the Constitution. He did, however, join them towards the end. Barton was invited as a substitute, a little bit unexpectedly at the time, but it began a lifelong relationship with Griffith. And several others were invited along also, although their contributions were not as critical. The early part of the journey was very choppy. They almost all got seasick, which delayed the start of work. And Griffith, unfortunately, probably caught from Inglis Clark influenza, and he was sick over that time. But as been mentioned before, he was an extraordinary worker, and they worked very hard to produce a draft of the Constitution. 3 long days from Easter Saturday until the Monday evening. Griffith, in a letter to his wife, complaining that he had worked too hard on the Constitution, and rather touchingly, that he was very homesick. While the draft developed on the Lucinda was refined and redrafted, both at subsequent proceedings and later conventions, it provided the fundamentals. It is the draft that was amended, and our Constitution today bears a striking resemblance to the one that came from the Lucinda. Griffith's drafting permeates our Constitution, therefore, and it remains one of his most remarkable legacies. Those 3 days on the Lucinda, perhaps not at all widely known in Australia, and yet an absolutely critical time. If I could be forgiven a brief digression about the Lucinda. It continued to operate for some time as a Queensland official vessel of state, carried some very eminent people. It was determined to be obsolete in 1922 and was made a coal barge for some decades before being sunk to create an artificial reef. In the United States, one can't help but think there would be a secular shrine to such a place. This really is quite a sad fate. But in light of current events, I did note as I was reading up about this that the Lucinda carried the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall in 1901. Their plan had been to sail from Melbourne to Brisbane, but they couldn't do it because there was a plague in Melbourne, and if they had sailed into the port of Brisbane, they would have all been quarantined for 14 days before being allowed in. Some things change and some do not. While it's impossible to do justice to all Griffith's contributions in the short presentation this evening, and indeed given the collective nature of the drafting aboard the Lucinda and elsewhere, it's not always possible to accurately attribute specific contributions, it is worth noting he played an important role in resolving many controversies, and I'll highlight only two tonight. The first was with respect to interstate trade and tariffs, and the second, the balance of power between larger and smaller states, particularly how this played out in the Senate. For some delegates, the issue of interstate trade was absolutely critical, particularly those who were concerned that they would not be financially viable without the revenue provided by tariffs between the colonies. In the end, it was others that convinced them that there were alternative sources of revenue and all would be well. But it was Griffith who drafted the succinct phraseology that interstate trade, commerce and intercourse would be absolutely free. The wording was simple, elegant, seemingly self-explanatory, classic Griffith. It satisfied the delegates at the time, but as we all know, went on to be the most litigated couple of words in the Australian Constitution, and even as we speak, there's an important piece of litigation being undertaken with respect to Section 92. Griffith wasn't as concerned with this dispute as some. His key concerns were about ensuring that the states retained strong independent identities while not undermining federalism, and that smaller state interests were not swallowed up by larger states, that they retained the largest possible degree of self-government. And as was mentioned by the Chief Justice, he'd had an interesting experience in thinking about these issues more deeply than some. The composition of the Senate was one obvious place in which the interests of the smaller states could be protected. A critical issue was the power the Senate would have, particularly in relation to financial matters. Victoria was scarred from battles with the Legislative Council, which had used their fairly conservative power over money bills to stymie more progressive legislative agendas. Victoria would have preferred the Senate to have no power over money bills at all, and at one stage was prepared to walk over the issue. Some of the smaller states, seeing it as a place to exercise control, wanted full ordinary powers as they would have over any bill to amend to veto specific provisions. In the end, a compromise was needed, and Griffith supported and became the key advocate of the ultimately successful middle view that allowed the Senate to reject but not amend money bills. He convinced the smaller states that the power to veto in the whole was still a significant power, which it was. For all the great legal minds in the room, however, it was only the dying McCrossan, who'd die a fortnight after this speech, who foresaw that the Senate would become far more captured by allegiance to party than to state. Griffith was not a member of subsequent conventions, partly because he was then Chief Justice of Queensland, which probably would have made it inappropriate, and partly because Queensland didn't attend. But he continued to be respected by key players and was a source of constant informal consultation and advice throughout. While a few have questioned the importance of Griffith's role, political scientist L.F. Crisp describing him as narrow, conservative and parochial in his influence on federalism, most, including many of the other key figures at the time of Federation, recognised his seminal role in drafting a constitution that's shown remarkable endurance. A University of Chicago study has shown that since 1789, the average constitution has lasted only 17 years, and after 50 years, only 19% of constitutions remain. While self-deprecation can be a national hobby, at nearly 120 years of continuous existence, the constitution that Griffith played such a key role in creating is an achievement of which I believe we can be proud.
Thank you, Professor Evans. Our final speaker is Professor Sarah Joseph, who is also a constitutional lawyer and human rights lawyer. Sarah started at Griffith Law School in 2020 after 25 years at Monash University, including 15 years leading its Caston Centre for Human Rights Law. Professor Joseph will speak to us about the Griffith Court.
So, thank you very much. It falls to me to discuss the final phase of Sir Samuel's public life, his long period as the first Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia from its establishment in 1903 until his retirement in 1919. It's difficult now to contemplate the freedom of that first High Court. Though the court is not necessarily bound by its own precedents, it's even freer when there are no precedents. And this, of course, is especially so with constitutional law, where the wording obviously profound, but also quite sparse, giving rise to a greater range of potential interpretation compared to the ordinary statute. The Griffith Court, in terms of constitutional law, is remembered for two major doctrines: the doctrine of implied intergovernmental immunities and the reserved powers doctrine. The first doctrine limited the legislative powers of the federal partners, the Commonwealth and the states, when it came to regulating each other. It first appeared in the third decision of the court, Demden and Pedder, in 1904, when it was decided that a Commonwealth officer could not be required to pay state income tax. Hence, states could not bind the Commonwealth. And the reciprocal immunity was confirmed a couple of years later in the railway servants case, that is, the Commonwealth could not bind the states. This idea of intergovernmental immunity was based on the fact that the states and the Commonwealth, as separate sovereign governments, were prohibited from interfering in each other's affairs. And in developing this case law, the High Court, and I suspect actually Sir Samuel Griffith, was very much influenced by United States case law. Alongside the doctrine of intergovernmental immunities was the reserved powers doctrine. And this was a way of interpreting the Commonwealth heads of power narrowly to ensure that those powers did not improperly trespass on the powers that were apparently reserved to the states. A classic example of this is the case of the Crown and Barger. The relevant federal law imposed a tax on goods, but it exempted those goods which had been manufactured under fair and reasonable working conditions. Now, the law was said to be valid because it came under the Commonwealth's head of power for tax, but it was in fact characterised by the majority as falling outside the power of taxation as it crossed into the reserved area of labour conditions. Now, some exceptions arose, notably in a much later case called Ferry and Burvett. There, an expansive interpretation of the defence power was adopted, which was very much influenced by the date of that decision, 1916, during the Great War. And of course, the Great War may have been when a true national spirit of Australia emerged, perhaps replacing fealty to the states. Now, the High Court started with 3 judges. It increased to that's in 1903. It increased to 5 judges in 1906 and 7 in 1913. The original 3 judges, Griffith, Barton and O'Connor, had a seemingly uniform vision of the Constitution. And things changed a lot in 1906 with the addition of Justices Isaacs and Higgins. Those 2 judges had a much more national approach, and they consistently dissented regarding the 2 doctrines that I've spoken of. Later on, Gavin Duffy replaced O'Connor, and Richard Powers joined what became a 7-man bench, and the number has, of course, remained 7 for over 100 years. Sir Samuel sat on 950 reported cases. His tenure lasted through 10 federal governments, which is an average of just over 18 months per government. He sat on the Privy Council in 1913 and was reportedly unimpressed with the fusty law lords and advocated for the appointment of more judges from the Dominions. Given the number of governments, 10 governments during the Griffith Chief Justiceship, he was apparently consulted regularly by Governors-General on the reserved powers, in particular the power regarding the dissolution of Parliament, or whether to allow it or whether to disallow it, given the large numbers of governments and governments falling. He also, while Chief Justice, served as a Royal Commissioner into Australia's required troop levels after 2 failed and highly politicised referenda on conscription. Of course, these days that would breach the Boilermakers doctrine, but even then it gave rise to considerable controversy regarding the separation of powers, and it is the last time a High Court judge chaired a Royal Commission. Griffith suffered a stroke in 1917 and he withdrew from the court for almost a year. He returned, but he didn't sit on many cases in 1918 and 1919. He retired on the 17th of October 1919 after 16 years as Chief Justice. Less than a year later, he died at the age of 75 on the 9th of August 1920, which was 100 years ago last Sunday. 3 weeks later, the seminal Engineers case was decided, which is said to have exploded both the Intergovernmental Immunities Doctrine and the Reserve Powers Doctrine. The Higgins and Isaacs line of thinking finally prevailed. And with that one decision, much of the doctrinal legacy of that original court was swept away. A form of intergovernmental immunities returned a few decades later with the Melbourne Corporation case. The Reserve Powers Doctrine has not returned, and it seemed for a while as if one of the worst insults a judge could aim at another was to keep the, quote, pre-engineers ghosts walking. That is until Justice Callanan, a fellow Queenslander, I believe, came out with a brickbat for engineers in the Work Choices case in 2006. And I note that Justice Callanan had written an earlier chapter on Sir Samuel in a book kindly lent to me by Peter Applegather. And this is a quote from R.T.E. Latham, a barrister who was actually the son of Chief Justice Latham, talking about the engineers case and claiming the engineers case deprived Australian constitutional law of American precedents, a copious source of thoroughly relevant learning, in favour of the crabbed English rules of statutory interpretation, which are one of the sorriest features of English law. I want to end on a very different issue regarding the legacy of the Griffith Court, and that is the fact that it went on strike in 1905. Now, this episode started with a request by Sir Samuel for payment of the installation of bookshelves in his Sydney office, and it escalated from there. Ultimately, the Attorney-General at the time, Sir Josiah Simon, wanted the High Court to sit always in its seat, which these days is Canberra, but in those days was Melbourne, rather than travel to the various states to hear appeals from the Courts of Appeal. And so this escalated to become a fight over travel expenses, bookshelves, salaries for ancillary staff, and even telephone charges. Now, in early May 1905, Justice O'Connor was meant to sit on a civil jury trial in Melbourne, but at the time there was no guarantee his expenses from Sydney, where he lived, would actually be paid. So he didn't go, and the trial was delayed by a week. The Attorney-General was livid. He accused the High Court of, quote, a departure from the accustomed traditions of the bench as to refuse judicial duty and delay justice to compel the executive to concede a pecuniary demand. The spat continued until early July 1905, when the government resigned for unrelated reasons, and so the Attorney-General lost his position. The new Attorney-General in the new Deakin government acceded to all of the High Court's demands. That Attorney-General was Sir Isaac Isaacs, who himself benefited from the demands when he joined the court a year later. Simon returned to the back bench, where he introduced private members' bills to try and rein in High Court spending, and all of them failed. Now, the High Court has remained a circuit court ever since, and it does, of course, sit periodically outside Canberra. A consequence, this I'm indebted to a paper from Justice Gageler on the episode, is also an expansive notion of judicial independence. That is, not just the judicatory independence, but also administrative and institutional independence. And finally, Sir Samuel did get his bookshelves. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Joseph. May I, on your behalf, thank each of the speakers for a marvellous presentation, full of detail and compressed into 10 minutes. We've raced through Sir Samuel's life, and I hope now we'll have a chance to discuss some matters as a panel. We've heard of the book, The Enigmatic Mr. Deakin, but I think tonight we've heard a little about the enigmatic Samuel Griffith. Raymond, perhaps you can start the conversation as to whether our assessment of Griffith as a person is shaped by Deakin's journalism. Deakin first made the acquaintance of Griffith in 1883 at the Intercolonial Conference and described Griffith as lean, aesthetic, cold, with a sceptical and almost cynical manner. What do you think? Was Griffith a cold, analytical individual or a passionate man, or somehow both?
Well, I suppose like many human beings, he was many things. He could certainly be all those things you just mentioned. But, you know, there was a certain kind of romanticism about him in relation to what I was talking about, you know, his Welsh experience. He really wanted to be found to be a descendant of tribal kings of Wales. You know, that's hardly cold and austere and removed. He had a romance about him, and to me that is kind of like a way of almost contrast with his actual material origins in that terribly squalid and dirty town, you know. It was much better for him to think that he had that romantic past, that romantic Welsh past in his life. So, you know, to some degree, well, complexity again, you know, and as you were saying in your speech, agility, you know, oily, as they used to call him, slippery Sam and so on. So he can be many things, and he's very hard to pin down. We might need a new biography.
Well, Professor Evans, you don't have time to write a new biography. But perhaps another interesting matter that you touched on, and Professor Evans, your studies into religion probably raised this as well. Griffith came from a deeply religious family, but he, probably to the disappointment of his parents, gained an acquaintance with alcohol and then fell under the secular influence of a university education. What do we make of the role of religion in Griffith's life and his values? Professor Evans, would you like to?
One thing I think that is interesting is that he wasn't part of establishment religion in the then colony, and nor was he part of the Catholic tradition, which was the other major tradition at the time. So I think it did give an interesting perspective of somebody who was a little bit to the outside, whether that was as a religious minority or over time as a secular thinker. Not uncommon at that period of time. It was a period of disruption and a period where there was a lot more challenging of the religious norms of the time. As you know, that was a complex issue for the Australian Constitution to grapple with, because you had people who were very firmly and strongly of the view that it should have a religious sensibility, and that needed to permeate it some, and there were people who saw those dangers very strongly as well. And so you get this odd sort of compromise with the preamble, humbly relying on the blessings of Almighty God, which sounds nice but probably doesn't mean anything very much, and Section 116 modelled on the US with a prohibition of establishment and a protection of religious freedom, which could mean a lot, but has been interpreted to not mean very much. But, you know, he was probably a man of the time in that way, caught between those competing influences.
It's interesting that he started life as a nonconformist, but it was after his father died that he then embraced the Church of England. Dr. Kay Saunders has said Griffith possessed a complex and contradictory personality. His lower middle-class Welsh nonconformist origins were eventually transformed into upper-class Australian Welsh aristocratic Church of England achievement. So I guess there's that agility or growth or change. The early reforming politician who went into Parliament in 1872, smaller Liberal, made common cause with Lilly and others against the squattocracy. What values, what do you think were the formative influences on that progressive, was it a religious drive or a learning at the university? What was behind his beliefs?
Well, again, it's probably a combination of the religious nonconformity in his early life, but also, you know, Sydney University was a very progressive institution at the time, and one of his lecturers there was an active abolitionist, had come from the abolitionist movement, you know, which explains some of his antagonism towards the squattocracy and the plantocracy using bonded labour, coloured bonded labour. which was very close to slavery, as we're now starting to realise historically. So I think probably his own intellect and his own institutional background, his institutional secular background in Sydney University had a lot to do with the way he turns out.
Perhaps I can ask John Mckenna a question about influences on Griffith as a lawyer. You mentioned he didn't have, of course, a law degree, but in terms of influences, either individuals or authors, or did he read particular legal scholars, Blackstone, or who influenced him, do you think?
I can't pin it down to any particular scholar that influenced him, but to me the biggest influence on him was the influence of principle. Being freed from mountains of authority, having the freedom to reason from first principles seems to have been a key aspect of his life as a practicing lawyer, and also reflected in his time on the court, but also as a parliamentary draftsman, as a draftsman of a constitution. If you're freed of that clutter of detail in your mind and can focus on principle and trying to express it in an elegant way, I think it actually liberates you in many ways. And I think that was, to me, the most influential part of his thinking or his development as a lawyer.
Perhaps, Chief Justice, you'd like to say something about Griffith's work in the code. You remarked about the advantages of the code.
Well, it was just something he dashed off while being Chief Justice and translating Dante. It has stood up remarkably well, and personally I think a lot of the amendments to it haven't worked so well over time. So I'm a big enthusiast of the code as it is. I might say, though, I think that I haven't dashed off any criminal codes or translated Dante, but on the other hand, I feel that Sir Samuel Griffith never washed a dish.
I mentioned earlier that Macaulay, who probably didn't have great reasons to love Griffith because Griffith was in the majority in Macaulay's case. Macaulay wrote of Griffith, as a lawyer, his judgments are admirable, not only for their learning but also for their style. They are stated with a precision that belongs rather to mathematics than to law, and he had indeed a remarkable directness and lucidity. Perhaps we can discuss his style and how much that style gave way to the substance of the Constitution. Perhaps we can ask Sarah Joseph to... you've read a lot of his judgments. The Hand of a Mathematician.
As a non-mathematician, it's hard for me. I mean, I think they're. I think that there is a certain style to reading them, and I return to that quote that I made from R.T.E. Latham, that he seemed to have a more, a worldly view of what it was like to be, on the High Court of Australia, which wasn't inevitable, I don't think, for a Chief Justice to adopt that. They could have adopted a much more parochial or sort of almost smaller view of themselves, yet he saw this sort of grand view from America. And I think that's a really interesting statement by Latham to say, I mean, it's probably rough to say that engineers took it all away from us, but it probably did to a certain extent. I think there are problems with some of the doctrines that emerged. I think there are problems with the reserve powers doctrine, but he constructed those judgments because I get the feeling that he was absolutely certain that he knew what was meant in the draft of the Constitution. And other people were probably just as certain the other way, but he and that dominated for 16 years. I think it's remarkable that majority sort of stayed. There was always a minority after 1906, but it stayed together until he was off the court, and then very quickly changed its mind. But force of personality, I guess, kept them, rounded them up somehow.
Perhaps I can ask the Chief Justice about force of personality in appellate courts without referring to any contemporary individuals. What do you think about Griffith as a judicial leader both in the state and in the Commonwealth?
It must have been a huge advantage to have had so much time as Premier running the state to have been involved in the drafting of the Constitution. You can see how you would step into the role with complete confidence. He'd also dominated things so much in Queensland for so long, the legal profession, the politicians, that it's not surprising that he was able to dominate any court he sat on as Chief Justice. He had it made before he ever began. So.
And it's said that, of course, they delivered oral judgments and Barton would have had a judgment written, then Griffith gave the first judgment, and Barton often, it was said, just didn't deliver his judgment because he didn't think he could add anything. So he just simply said, I agree. Perhaps we haven't touched on one area of the law. We're focused on drafting the Constitution, the Code, Defamation Act, which I got to know and love. But there's the general law, John, so I think we overlook Griffith's legacy in terms of the general law. So would you care to say something about that?
It's interesting to do searches to find which legal characters from 100 or so years ago still have influence on the modern law, and there really aren't very many. Griffith really is one of the few who, in his pronouncements on general law issue, continues to provide guidance to modern courts. I've done this exercise for Queensland judges, and apart from Gibbs's era on the Queensland Supreme Court and some of Philp's judgments in the criminal law, Griffith is really the one character who continues to have an influence in so many different ways, but particularly in law of contract.
Can I just mention there too, and it's also to be remembered that he ensured that the evidence of Indigenous people could be received, which is an interesting thing for his time.
It's interesting, I mentioned the Defamation Act that he drafted, and it's incredible seeing his speech introducing that. It's like a mini lecture on the law of defamation where he's explaining common law concepts and the like, and he says, here I've gone a little bit further than the common law, and to actually hear an Attorney General who has drafted the law, and in that regard he was a smaller liberal. He extended the common law and provided a defence of qualified privilege for people to engage in good faith and public discussion of matters of public interest. And it's interesting, only in the last few weeks the state attorneys general have embraced effectively a similar form of defence. So it is interesting how some of these values came through. Raymond, did you want to add anything to?
There was one little thing I wanted to mention, and this is speculative, but you were mentioning him translating Dante and being very preoccupied with it, enormously preoccupied. And when I was doing the research on Mirtha and those blast furnaces in, Cavartha Ironworks and Dowlais, the biggest factories in the world at the time, the blast furnaces, the flames were so huge that you could see it 50 miles away, and it lit up the front of the houses. It must have made an impact on him when he went there in 1866 and he actually toured the Cavartha Ironworks, and maybe subliminally, maybe subconsciously, the images of that were playing in his mind when he was translating, the levels of hell in Dante. I mean, it's purely speculative, but it did cross my mind. I was thinking about Tolkien, taking part in World War I and then reading it into his interpretation of Mordor, the trenches and the horror of the trenches. So the terrible nature of that work experience, for those workers of Merthyr Tydfil, may have inspired him to work so hard on translating Dante? Just a speculation.
It's interesting, Griffith had an enormous capacity for drink. When he was a politician, he went up to Burketown and drank everyone under the bar. It is extraordinary that he had the productivity that he he did. What should we do to think more about Griffith? Or there's a need for a biography, but apart from renaming this building Griffith, what do you think, Professor Evans, would be a good field of study?
Well, the field of study is one thing, but field of action is another. And one of the great legacies of the Australian Constitution is that it was left in the hands of the Australian people to determine what it should look like in the future. Those who wrote it didn't have the arrogance to assume that they would have something that could be fit for purpose for all times, and it's lasted remarkably well. But in fact, I think one of the things that we need to do to honour that legacy is to start engaging with the Constitution as it was drafted and the Constitution as it fits today. And some of it still stands up remarkably well, and some of it does not. And really, rather than simply revering what went on in the past, we should take a leaf out of the book of those who had the courage to stand up and create a constitution for a new nation that was fit for the time. And they offered us the opportunity to do that. It must be admitted, Griffith perhaps not being quite so keen on more democratic models as some of the others. But in many ways, for me, that is the better way to think about the legacy, is to try and engage the widest Australian citizenry in understanding the Constitution, in knowing about it, and having the confidence to say we can embrace it as a wonderful document for the time, as a democratic document for the time, but not necessarily still entirely fit for purpose for our time. And I would like to see a lot more Australians feel comfortable with thinking about and debating those ideas.
What do you think Griffith would make of the implied freedom of political communication? Do you think he intended that to be a necessary implication? But I'd perhaps ask this more general question, perhaps of Sarah Joseph. It's interesting that Griffith on one level was very interested in the American Constitution, but there was no attempt on his part to introduce, with some limited exceptions, what we'd call today human rights. We didn't have a Bill of Rights of any form. What do you, having read his judgment and read about him, what do you think informed that reserve?
He would not be against the idea of implications. He was very, he was quite prominent in endorsing implications himself. And he, for the time, did support some human rights causes for the Pacific Islanders, for Indigenous people, for labour rights. But as has been said, he was, overly agile with regard to those issues. And was always, I gather, he was fairly consistent in being anti-Chinese. So I think that was one of the reasons against the Bill of, why a Bill of Rights was not ultimately adopted within our Constitution. Another being adherence to parliamentary sovereignty and so on. So he would endorse the implication side of things. Whether he really would agree with the implied freedom of political communication, it's not something I've thought about a lot. But George Williams wrote an article very soon afterwards. I mean, engineers, in some ways, the engineers' case is said to kind of put a full stop to the Griffith Court. And George Williams wrote an article which had, after the implied freedom, which had the title, "Engineers is dead, long live engineers." So, in that sense, he might be, the fact that it doesn't really, arguably doesn't really comply with engineers very much. He'd probably like that part of it.
Now, any other contributions?
I feel I should add a little bit something. And that is on that business of making allowance for the contribution of labour. He actually probably wasn't as cynical about it as I've suggested, although he certainly did drop it like a hot coal when he got into coalition with a Conservative. But he was still writing about it years later as Chief Justice and advancing those ideas, so he never did lose it completely. And that may be the idealist to some extent in him, or the romantic coming out. So,
on the website, there are some links to some papers, and we'll try to add some more. One of them is a fantastic article describing Griffith as the great Provincial, and I'll read part of it by way of conclusion. In so many aspects of his life, he began as an outsider, a marginal man distanced from the centres of prestige and authority. It was not just that he was a Queenslander in a continent where wealth and population were concentrated in Victoria and New South Wales. He was Welsh, not English, Congregationalist, not Anglican or Catholic, a colonial, not a metropolitan Briton. And even in the colonial context, he was a product of Maitland and Brisbane, not the cities of Melbourne and Sydney. He could not have been anything else but a provincial. The impressive thing about Griffith is that he grew into a great provincial, ready and able to tackle the challenge of knitting together the colonial provincialisms of his time into the makings of an Australian nation. And there's much more to read on the website and much more to read about Griffith. This has just been an introduction to encourage you to read on. Yesterday I came across a fantastic website created by Andrew Fraser, who was once Queensland Treasurer, and he feels strongly about Griffith. And he created, of his own volition, with the help of some teenagers, a website. And I'd encourage you to look at it. It's called Samuel Griffith with 2020 hindsight. If you just Google that, Samuel Griffith with 2020 hindsight. He said, if the actions of Griffith and others had failed, we could easily be a continent of more than one nation. Nations don't get many chances like the one our colonial forebears converted into our Commonwealth. Griffith is the James Madison of Australia, author of the Constitution, author of the legislation that created the High Court and its first Chief Justice, and much, much more. Well, there's much, much more to read about Griffith. We hope there'll be much, much more to talk about at lectures to come. But I think with the Chief Justice's inspiration, Griffith was many things. Agile, he was a smaller Liberal, he was a Conservative, he was all of those things. I think if we've learned one thing tonight, Griffith isn't the two-dimensional character that might emerge from a simple cursory review of the Griffith Court and the engineer's doctrine. He isn't simply the radical reforming politician. He is a complex individual. We have so much to thank him for, but because he's so complex, he's so interesting, and I hope that this is the start of an ongoing conversation about Griffith and his legacy over the coming years. Thank you.